Hello everybody. This is the first online lecture for the College of New Jersey, Spring 2020, and it is the series of lectures. It's called Caves to Cathedrals, and we have already covered the caves, and we have covered the arts of Egypt and Mesopotamia and Cycladic Islands, and we also covered the island of Crete and the entire history of Greece, which included first the Mycenaean civilization, and then the civilization of archaic Greece, classical Greece, Hellenistic Greece, and we then embarked upon Rome. And this is the Roman lecture, and in this lecture we have already covered the art of the Etruscans and the early history of Rome through Augustus. And it just so happens that Rome did not produce much art until Augustus. Rome was a little too busy bullying other nations around and expanding tremendously, and proving to the world that they were the greatest, the most extraordinary bully, and but also deliverers of peace and prosperity and law. So, as ever, the bad things come with the good. With all the first lectures of any series, I would like in this spring of woe to give my thanks to this technological age we live in, which allows us to deliver these kind of lectures online. But also, and most importantly, I would truly express my thanks to the medical profession, to all the people who work in it and who have no choice to run away and hide under blankets, who have no choice not to go to work, who must be where they are to protect us and save us, and in the end, without question, deliver us. So thank you so much, I really, from the bottom of my heart. And now we begin. This is, as I said, in this lecture we already covered the beginning up until Augustus, and then Augustus finally inaugurated peace, because Rome had not really seen peace for 150 years. The last civil war was between Augustus and Mark Antony and Cleopatra. As a result, Augustus came out victorious. Mark Antony and Cleopatra, alas, both committed suicide in Egypt, and Augustus began building his empire very capably, I must say. He may have been a boor before all power was his, but then he demonstrated extraordinary capacity for administration, unification, and rule, and indeed inaugurated 200 years of peace in the Roman Empire. And yes, before his death, he very famously said that he inherited Rome of brick and he left Rome of marble, which is very true, even though still much of Rome was still of brick. However, we begin to see beautiful things. And one of the very beautiful things is this Gemma Augustea, which is a gem, a cameo, which is carved out of a two-layered stone. It's a double-layered. Here is, do I have my pointer? Yes, a double-layered Arabian onyx stone. You cut through the first layer, which is white, and then you reach the second layer. It requires an extraordinary degree of precision and craftsmanship. This sort of piece of work belonged to private art, not public art, but private art that was commissioned by very wealthy people, including the imperial family, of course, as presents to each other to those who pleased them, those who served them well. And this is a rather large cameo, and it is divided into two registers. Actually, you know, where my pointer doesn't show, I have this Russian spoon, and I can point with that. So it's divided into two registers, and in the upper register we see Augustus himself, presumably. I mean, we guess at all of that. This is Augustus, who is sitting on a throne with the goddess Roma, because Rome herself was personified. She is portrayed here as the goddess Athena, and she receives Augustus in her own throne after his death as an equal. Not only he is an equal, but right underneath him is an image of an eagle, which was a symbol of Zeus. So here Augustus is shown as on par with Zeus. He is crowned by laurel wreath, with the laurel wreath by the goddess, who wears on her head sort of a citadel of sorts, a fortification. And she is the personification of the goddess Oikoumea, which is the world itself. To the right of Augustus is a chariot, which is done very beautifully. It is done in a foreshortening, and off the chariot steps presumably Tiberius, who was Augustus's heir, and who presumably commissioned this cameo. Victory drives the four horses of the chariot, and also right here we have a symbol of Capricorn, which is usually taken as a sign of Augustus's birth. But the only thing is that Augustus was born under the sign of Libra. He was born in late September, and Capricorn takes you from December into January. And the one man who was born under Capricorn was Mark Antony, whom Augustus defeated, and which was the last civil war. So frankly, I mean, I don't know why Augustus chose Capricorn, and he loves Capricorn. He has Capricorn everywhere. He has it on his coins, and very specifically there he says Augustus, and this is Capricorn, which is sort of a sea goat, and this sea goat is universal. The sea goat rules the ocean, and in her front legs it has the world. It has the globe. And since Augustus apparently identifies with the Capricorn, there is the world in his hands. And well, frankly, really, to think about it, it's not that surprising that that he has taken it as his own symbol. After all, he has taken all the names of all the dignities of Caesar, and he, even though he is his nephew twice removed, he became an adopted son of Caesar, and took on his imperia and his name and his dominions. So why not take the birth sign of Mark Antony? It all works together. So there he is. Now on the second register is shown one of the conquests of Augustus. Now Augustus himself was not much of a warrior, but through his generals he continued to conduct Roman expansion. And what we see here are the the Romans, who are raising their colors, their flag, and after having just conquered the barbarians. And there are a couple of barbarians, male and female, at first being taken captive, and here they are also captive at this point. So this is one of the beautiful things that came down to us from the time of Augustus. Last time in this lecture we looked at the Arapaches, at the altar of peace that was built for Augustus by Lydia, his extraordinary wife, and so this is the second piece of art. This is just the close-up of the second register. I mean, there aren't all that many things that have survived through all the disasters and all the wars and all the invasions, but we are fortunate enough to have some of them that did, from the Augustan era. And one of them is this temple of Portunus in Rome, in the Roman Forum, in the part that was Forum Borealum, which faced the Tiber, and where the meat market was, and also where the port was as well. And as the ships came into port, they came to the temple of the god of the ports to thank him for safe arrival and for safe delivery. It is actually quite a typical Etruscan temple, and we saw the Etruscan art before. Etruscans, of course, emulated the Greeks, except they cut corners a bit. Instead of having the columns all around the temple, they just had them in the front, supporting the porch right here. Only 1, 2, 3, 4, only 8 of these columns are actually functional. They bear the weight of this porch. And then the rest of the columns on the side and in the back are decorative, because Etruscans figured, well, I mean, why spend time and money? And Romans, of course, being very, very practical people, emulated them. Why spend time and money for something that doesn't really make sense? We'll just make believe that they're there. So they are decorative, just so the wall doesn't look way too boring, but they are in a way a little functional, because as you see this bit of architecture right here is carried around the body of the temple and the entresol, and it is supported by at least it is made to seem to be supported by these half colonnades, so integrity is preserved. It's of beautiful proportion. The order is Ionic, and it is still there to be seen. Another temple from that era, and also very proportional, very dedicated to balance and equity, and it is in Nîmes in the south of France. It's a much larger temple. It is called Maison Carrée because well, it appears square. In fact, Thomas Jefferson, when he came to the south of France some 300 years ago, was so smitten by it that he, when he came back to America, he proceeded to design, well, his own house, and then the future Washington D.C. according to the Roman principles, among which Maison Carrée, of course, figured very much. So when one goes to Washington D.C. today, you'll see a lot of Maison Carrée in town. It is this time. It is not an Ionic. It is a Corinthian temple, but designed on the same principles as the other small temple that we had just seen. In this case, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 18 columns are functional, and the rest of them, as you see right here, again are decorative. But this is very much the Roman architecture, and this architecture will be emulated for the next many centuries. Now, while the Greeks, and this in their own term, turn is emulated from the Greeks. And the Greeks, they preferred the architecture of two posts and a lintel, rectangular structures. The Romans, however, will embrace an arch, and they'll do all sorts of things with an arch which will be quite extraordinary. Well, this is a simple arch, a typical Roman arch that consists of a keystone, which holds, of course, all the voussoirs that are built around. The arch begins with constructing the so-called wooden centering around which the arch is built, and then the centering is removed. The voussoirs essentially hold each other by pressure, and as such, a Roman arch is self-sustaining. Take away the keystone, the whole thing will fall apart. The arch, if extended forward or backwards, will produce a so-called barrel vault, as you see it here. This is the barrel vault, which is heavy. A barrel vault presses down, which is why the structures that require barrel vault also require very, very thick walls, as you see here, just to hold that weight. Otherwise, you see these arrows right there, they push out, and they push the wall out as well. So soon enough, the Romans came up with another brilliant design, and that is the design of a groin vault. And that is the two barrel vaults intersecting one another, as you see it here, one and another, creating the so-called groin vault, in which all the stresses go into four corners, 1, 2, 3, 4 over there, thus opening, leaving the entrances open, and having much more free space for windows, doorways, what have you. Again, the arch, the barrel vault, then it could be manipulated, and then of course then turned around itself. It could be made into a dome. One of the brilliant constructions that the Romans did, of course, were the aqueducts. Rome and Roman cities depended on aqueducts entirely for their private hygiene, for their baths, for drinking water, for cooking water, for hydraulic power, for their bread mills, I mean for everything. For their medicine, of course, and the aqueducts, well, they're basically the carriers of water, and for the most part, the Romans built them underground, because it's much easier to take care of them when they're underground and to maintain them when they're underground. But in those cases when it was absolutely impossible to go underground, or rather very expensive, less expensive to build bridges, and these bridges would then carry water. That's what we usually associate with the aqueducts, because we see them, well, they're above ground, obviously. And here is one of the most famous ones, and that's Pont du Gard. It's literally a bridge over the river Gar, right here, which is very, very shallow. So in the summer, it dries up, and with little puddles where children play and squeal and just being adorable. This one is designed with the equal number of arches on the lower and the second register, and then about four small arches per big one in the upper register. The upper register almost looks like a moving train. Well, obviously the Romans didn't know about the moving train, but the idea of style and the idea of beauty was very much there, even though the Romans were very practical people. But what they did manage to do in cases like these is the ability to combine both style and practicality. The lower story, as you can see, is much thicker than the second story, because it carries the weight. It carries the weight of not only the upper stories, but also of the water that runs over there through channels, and through lead channels, in fact. And the beauty of it is very apparent. even though it is completely unadorned, the Romans did not face the aqueduct with marble, or, well, that would be very, very expensive, or even limestone, even polished limestone. They didn't even bother to polish the stone itself, the masonry itself, of which this aqueduct is built. And that, in fact, they did in a way, was a double purpose. Well, the purpose number one, of course, was considerably less expensive not to polish it. And the reason number two, it kind of conveyed the raw energy, the raw majesty of Rome, its unstoppability, if you will. There's even masonry sort of sticking out of the surface. You can see it here. It's projecting from the body of the aqueduct, and that is, in fact, to make scaffolding easier, to make the construction of scaffolding easier, so that the aqueduct could be maintained and could be repaired. It still very much serves as a bridge, and one can walk across it. There are two of these paths on each side, and they're just about the size of a chariot that could go across it. So thus, this aqueduct. Another one that still exists is the aqueduct of Segovia, and it is, well, in Segovia, Spain. And this one consists of two registers spanning this very, very beautiful deep valley in Segovia. Today there is a little image of the Virgin Mary in the middle of it, and modern concerts are given underneath on the platform. Now, however, when these aqueducts reach Rome proper, that's when the Romans attempted to embellish them. But again, interestingly, this, for instance, is the Porta. It's not Porta Maria Maggiore. It's Porta Maggiore. I have to change that. It's Maria Maggiore is a church. It's Porta Maggiore in Rome, where the aqueduct reached, and originally it was dedicated. It was built by Claudius, by the Emperor Claudius, and therefore here there are all sorts of inscriptions about the glory of the Emperor Claudius's reign. But what they're trying to do here they introduced it's a double entry, and they introduced the three pediments, which are polished and which are done very carefully, and together with Corinthian capitals on these columns. But the rest is done very much in what will be known later on in Italian Renaissance as the rustic style of masonry, and that is unadorned, unpolished masonry. It's as if to tell even the Romans that this water had come from long way away, and it had come here by gravity, as the aqueducts worked. And the idea of rusticity is still very much with us. The next emperor who built a spectacular building, very much a spectacular building, is the Emperor Vespasian, and he's the one who began the siege of Jerusalem in the year 70 AD, and that siege was then finished by his son Titus. They were from the family called the Flavians, and under the Flavians, fashions changed, and fashions always change. And the women now did their hair in these spectacular styles. It's very much crown-like. If you compare these styles with the portrait of Livia, who was the wife of Augustus, circa the year 0, you can see the difference. And indeed, it was not easy. It was sort of like building an Eiffel Tower on your head, with metal structures or whatever structures they had at their disposal to do this sort of thing on their heads. I think the 18th century beauties will probably loved these also, because God knows they built towers on their heads. What Vespasian today is very much remembered for is the construction of the Colosseum. Before him, the Emperor Nero, at the end of the first century, in the second half of the first century BC, after a huge fire, had appropriated public lands to build for himself an enormous palace. It was called a Golden Palace. And well, that wasn't the only reason why he was unpopular. The Emperor Nero was unpopular for many reasons, but that was one among them, that he appropriated all those lands and turned the palace essentially into a palace of orgies. So what Vespasian did when he came to power, the first thing he did was take down the palace of Nero, and that palace, in fact, had an enormous lake, an artificial lake, where Nero could have his mock battles. And he drained it, Vespasian drained the lake, and on that spot he built the Colosseum. It will be called the Colosseum later. At the time it was still called the Flavian Amphitheater. And this is what it looked like at the time. The one technique. Yes, is there a question? I have only one person here instead of a group of people, and I must say it's much easier to deliver these lectures, especially raw and without any editing, with an audience. So at least I have my daughter.
Hey!
Thank you very much. Please ask questions. Please correct me, because
No, I was just gonna say I know why it's called the Colosseum, because of the giant statue of Nero that was next to it that was called the Colossus, that after his dethronement or assassination, the face was re-chiseled to have the face of the god Helios.
Exactly.
Okay,
Perfect. Yes.
I didn't know.
Thank you very much. Thanks. No, thank you. No, by all means, add.
You were leaving the
edit.
Colosseum. I figured I'd throw it in before you fully left
absolutely.
the Colosseum.
Well, when I have a whole audience, they correct me because, again, I make mistakes all the time. They're called typos when you talk.
It's not a typo.
Well, you know what I mean. Typos of speech, confusing names and times and God knows what else. So when I have an audience, they correct me, and or at least in some cases they do. And well, at least I'm glad to have my daughter here. So absolutely, please correct me and interrupt me and add things.
Mwah.
At least I don't feel all alone. Not that I do. Okay.
Okay.
Back to the Colosseum. By this time, the Romans invented something extraordinary, and that is cement. They invented cement. Not only it was cement, but it solidified underwater. In fact, the reason they were able to build aqueducts underground and sometimes underwater is because they were built often of cement that solidified underwater. And then that cement took many shapes, and then of course it was faced. It was faced in brick, it was faced with marble, it was faced in different designs, and these designs are therefore called different things. The opus incertum, opus reticulatum, opus testaceum, all sorts of names for that. And cement could be shaped. Cement was much easier to work with because it could be shaped into forms, and shaped into forms it was. And again, one could manipulate the weight of cement, because if you add bits and pieces of granite, it becomes powerful and strong as a granite. Or you can add bits and pieces of tufa, which was a very porous stone, and then it becomes lighter. So all these manipulations were possible, and because of that, the Romans were able to experiment with architecture as the Greeks never did. So much of the Colosseum was built, particularly the lower sections, was built. They were built with the help of cement, and then of course faced with limestone, or they were faced with marble. Today, what we see, of course, is rather. Okay, let me get my spoon. Is rather sad compared to what it was. And the reason for that is not really the ages, even though obviously the ages had. The ages were very destructive, and so were the earthquakes. But the worst possible disaster befell the Colosseum as well as the rest of the Roman forums in the Renaissance, which is a contradiction in terms, because the Renaissance, which is rebirth of classical antiquity, was supposed to care greatly for classical antiquity, and they did for even some sculptures they grinded to lime. But in the Renaissance, when they decided to rebuild Rome after a century of neglect, while the popes were in Avignon, where do you think they went to get their marble or to get their limestone? They went to the Colosseum, and they went to the Roman Forum. It became a great, huge quarry, which is why today both the Forum and the Imperial Forums and the Colosseum are, for the large part, in the shape they're in. This was the sitting, and underneath are just fascinating structures. And if you're ever in Rome, it's not easily available, so you just need to schedule your tour online. But you can go underneath the Colosseum and to see the areas where gladiators were kept, and lions and tigers and bears. So very interesting. This is one of the reconstructions of how it was done, and how the animals were lifted up here and conducted into the arena. This is a great painting by Jean-Léon Gérôme from the late 19th century, and it's called Police Verso, the thumb down of a gladiator in a Colosseum. This is the imperial box, and right next to it is the box of the Vestal Virgins. And the Vestal Virgins, as you see, are very bloodthirsty. They're all pointing their thumb down for the poor devil to be killed. The painting is very dramatic, very beautiful, spectacularly painted. And I think it's in Hamburg, but I'll double check. All right, well, here it is. The Colosseum was organized again into tiers, into registers, and the wealthier, the more noble you are, the lower you sat, and then up above sat the hoi polloi, the poor, the women, and the slaves, in that order. The senators and senatorial wives, of course, senatorial families sat here, then the knights, then the plebeians, and then, as I said, the rest of the population. The inside was done at the bottom, certainly in marble, and then up above in local stone and in limestone. It had a canopy that. Rome was hot, and of course Rome was very hot in the summer. So it was drawn over the sitting area, and people in charge of these sails were the Imperial Navy, because they of course were competent in handling these large bodies of canvas. Here it is, and on the outside the Colosseum was much embellished, where there were shields here with various designs. And these are the poles upon which the canvas held. And then, of course, there was statuary of all the great men of Rome around the arches. What is very fascinating about the Colosseum is that it was the second structure. The first structure was the Theatre of Marcellus, but for our purposes, it is the first structure where the Tuscan, which is the same as Greek Doric, but adopted to Roman usage. So let's call it the Doric, the Ionic, and the Corinthian orders are all used together. And because the Doric order is the most masculine and muscular.
And muscular.
Exactly. Yeah. Thank you very much.
You got this.
And for this reason, that's the order that's upholding the entire structure. As here it is. So this is the Tuscan Doric order. And then the second floor becomes more elegant and more feminine and becomes Ionic. And then the third section here and the fourth are now purely decorative, and that is Corinthian. Now these are not columns, these are colonnettes, the semi-columns, and these are pilasters, rectangular semi-columns, right there. So, and this type of architecture, Doric first, then Ionic, then Corinthian, will become extremely common. Common in Rome, common in the Renaissance, common in America, common in Europe in the 19th century, in 18th century. So, but this is where it began. Another structure of the Flavians that is very much there in the Roman Forum is the Arch of Titus. Titus is the one who destroyed Jerusalem in the year 70. It is a single entrance arch, and let's see. And what it has, the most important thing about it, are these two reliefs, one on one side, one on the other side. And both reliefs are dedicated to Titus taking Jerusalem. So one of them, right here, shows Titus in a quadriga, which is a 4-horse chariot. White horses, gold chariot. He is given a triumph by his father when he came back to Rome to commemorate the great victory over the Jews. So that is one. And the second, hold on. And the second, right here, are the spoils of Jerusalem. And here, here is shown a genius of Roman sculptors, even though, unlike the Greek sculptors, the great Greek sculptors, we don't know their names. The Roman sculptors worked for the state, and the state was most important. And here shows a procession of men carrying the spoils of the Temple of Jerusalem. And they're sort of done a bit in a flat semicircle, beginning with the very low relief, and then the relief becomes bigger and bigger, almost becoming sculpture in the round, and then going back into, this is not the arch of Trajan, but a similar arch. And so on both sides of the arch, one is it shows the actual process of the destruction of the temple and the looting, yes, and removing the treasures of the temple. And the other one shows Trajan as he came back to Rome in his triumph. It is said, and it is rumored, and it's very possible that the reason the Flavian amphitheater, which we know as the Colosseum, that the money for building it much of the money came from the spoils of the Jerusalem temple. And now I know this looks very confusing, but a Roman forum is essentially a marketplace. I mean, that's what it is. Our marketplace is a Roman forum. Here in Princeton, for instance, the Princeton Shopping Center is a perfect Roman forum. It's just that where the Romans had their temple, we have the McCaffrey Food Market. But that's very much a temple for us. I mean, food is important. So it's a marketplace, and the very first Roman forum, and it's right here. That's the original Roman forum, which grew organically. That's why it doesn't look structured as these other forums look. But it began at the very beginning of the Roman, the existence of Rome as a kingdom at first, and then the Republic was a marketplace, grew, and then by the time of the Empire, it just wasn't sufficient. Even in our area in Princeton, I know that when I was in school, we had the Princeton Market Fair, and there was the Quaker Bridge Mall, I think, and Mercer Mall, and that's it. And then I went away for whatever, many years, and by the time I came back, my God, I didn't recognize the area because there's so many shopping centers now. And it's because all the companies moved here, the pharmacy, the pharmacological companies, and the financial companies, and God knows what other companies. There are lots of companies here. And with them, many people, and as a result, more shopping centers were needed and more forums were needed. Well, they're all empty today, unfortunately, but hopefully not for long, thanks to the medical profession. So that's what we're talking about here. So this is the Roman Forum right here, and you can see it there. I know it's confusing, but there it is. That's the Roman Forum. Then Julius Caesar was the first who built another forum right there, that little structure. That's the Forum of Julius Caesar. After him, his heir Augustus built his, and on other emperors built their own forums. And then the biggest forum of all will be the forum of the Emperor Trajan. He is the emperor under whom Rome, in the very beginning of the 2nd century AD, will reach its greatest expanse. Let's see, do I have a map here? I don't have a map yet. Okay, let's go back to Trajan. This is what the Roman Forum looks like today. It is much. It has not been happy in its existence, and as I said, the Renaissance popes did much to destroy it. This is what presumably it looked like during its happy years. This is the Roman Senate, right there, and this is a luxury boutique called Basilica Aemiliana. Again, this is the same forum from the other side, and when Augustus built his forum, it was not an organically built forum. It was a forum built to design, and as such, it was very beautifully appointed. The Forum of Trajan, as I said, is the greatest forum of them all, and the biggest. It was all laid out, presumably in marble, and that marble today is in the Renaissance palaces. The basilica stood across the forum, the Basilica Ulpia, because Ulpius was the name of the family of Trajan. And then, as you see, hold on, let me see here. So that's the courtyard right here. This is the basilica Ulpia, which was mostly used for law, for justice, law courts, this sort of thing. And then there were 2 libraries built on the other side, one Greek library, one Latin library. And then in the middle, there was a column built which was very original in its structure. Nothing like this existed before. And There's the column. Right, you can just see it. This is just another variant of the basilica. This presumably what it looked like. We can't know. This is one of the libraries, and you can see all the cabinets where the scrolls were kept. This is what the Roman Forum looked like even in the 11th, even in the 18th century. It was not until the 19th century when it began to be excavated, and it was in fact called the Cow's Field because that's where cows grazed at the time. And again, here it is. And this is our emperor, Trajan. And as you remember, the statue of Augustus. After that, all the emperors all their statues were very much based on the statue of Augustus. And as you see, such was the case with Trajan as well. And this again this is the other side. Now we're going through the other side, through here, the entrance gate. And this is our column. And finally, and this is our column, and the column still exists in its original, well, almost the original, because at first up on top was the column was the statue of Trajan, and today we have Saint Peter guiding us from the top. The statue, the column sat right between the two libraries, as I said, and it was very unusual in the sense that it essentially has a scroll roped around it, roped and wrapped around it.
Roped works too.
Roped works
yeah,
too?
yeah.
Okay, but it also
Corded, yeah.
Yeah.
You're great.
Thank you.
You're doing great.
And nothing like this. There was no design like this before. So many guess that because it sat between the two libraries and the majority of books were in scrolls, the architect had this brilliant idea of doing this column as a scroll, because the entire scroll is dedicated to Trajan's conquests in what today is Romania, and he was really the first emperor to cross the Danube up north and to conquer that area. And this is a very, very detailed description of those conquests. It was all painted, so you could see it better. Also, the farther one went up, the larger the scroll began. The scroll was made so one could see it better, but also because of the libraries, one could actually go up and up and up and see around it, walk around it and see it. Oops, wrong way. Here's the column as it is today. It still very much stands there. And as you see, much design is depicted in low relief on the column. And well, the Roman soldiers, as in their progress forward, they probably fought at best 1/3, no less, 20% of the time. And the other 80% of the time, they built. They built roads, they built bridges, they built baths, they built new towns. The towns where they would ultimately be pensioned off. And this column shows it all. It shows what they did. It shows how they crossed the rivers, how they crossed bridges, how they fight, no question about that. But also their mundane activities. Here, for instance, this is the allegory of Danube as they cross over into Romania. And this is this is just building cities. And more of the same. Here is Trajan addressing the troops. Interestingly, the same device is used on this column as perhaps you remember when we talked about Greece and when we talked about the Parthenon. Phidias, who was the architect of the, not architect, sorry, who was the sculptor of the Parthenon, he and his assistants, he came up with this brilliant device of carving the horses in a very naturalistic, beautiful way, but making them proportionally smaller than men, so that he could include as many horses as he wished. And if one really doesn't know about this device, one doesn't pay attention. It's only knowing it, because the horses were carved so beautifully that the eye just took on the naturalism of the carving without worrying about the size. But here, these as you see, these carvers do the same trick. The horses are very small, but without knowing it, you don't really notice. And this is the photograph of the detail from the column, and it's called Adlocution, again, where the emperor, we saw it before, addresses the troops. And it says here, it seems as if there's a lot of depth in this relief. In truth, it's only 5 centimeters. This. Yeah.
Wow.
I know, amazing, right? And here again, here's a commander addressing the troops as they sail the river. And in this case, this is a battle scene, and a Roman, very composed with his helmet on, is shown as moving forward, while the barbarian has no helmet and is consumed by his emotions instead of his rational discipline, and thus showing emotion versus intellect, even in battle, on the column. I know you like the barbarian.
He's got great hair.
I know, well, the other guy
great
has...
smile lines. Look at those smile lines.
Well, it's not supposed to be a smile. It's supposed to be the show of emotion, whereas the...
You're just saying that because you don't realize he's about to lop that Roman's head off. Look at this sword. Lop, lop.
Lop, lop. Well, the Roman, you can't read his emotions on his face. That's part of the game. Whereas the barbarian shows...
His poor wife.
Off we go. All right. You don't have to go to Rome to see the column of Trajan. If you happen to be in London after the coronavirus is over, if you happen to be in London back in the 19th century, Queen Victoria's husband, by the name of Albert, Prince Albert, came up with this brilliant idea. Well, he was a great educator, and he felt that the majority of the British population obviously cannot travel. They just have no money to travel. And but they must be educated, and therefore he established the Victoria and Albert Museum, where he commissioned the cast models of all the great monuments of the world. And museum, after his death, continued in the same strain, and the column of Trajan is there as well, not only as a column but also as drums. So the drums sit on eye level, and you can study them. You can look at them. Here's inside that's Victoria and Albert. Inside the real column, there's steps that lead you up, and they allow the maintenance of the column. All right. Parthenon was probably the most influential building, Greek building of Athens that was constructed in the middle of the 5th century BC. The next most or equally influential building is the Pantheon, and there's much confusion between Parthenon and Pantheon.
And Pergamon.
And Pergamon, right?
Forget the Pergamon.
Exactly.
This was the bane of my childhood.
But Parthenon is dedicated to Athena Parthenos, the virginal Athena, and therefore it's called the Parthenon. Whereas the Pantheon is sort of like a Baha'i temple. It's a temple of all gods. Pan is universal, like Pan America, Pan American Airlines. Yes?
I know the origin of that. Pan being the god of the wild, Pan used to mean all things, because all things that were wild.
Oh, well, thank you. I didn't know that.
I definitely just learned that from reading Percy Jackson.
Who's Percy Jackson?
It is a series of children's books about Greek gods.
Well, thank you very much. That's perfect. That works. Now you know where Pan comes from. And I do too. So, the pantheon. Theos, God, Pan, universal God. So this is the second equally influential structure as the Parthenon. It consists of, where's my spoon, of a traditional portico in the front, just as in the Greek temple, except it has 8 columns across. Well, so does the Pantheon. It has 8 columns across. The Pantheon columns are in Doric order, and these are in Corinthian order. And they are marble monolith. I think they're marble monolith columns, whereas, again, Parthenon is constructed, the columns are done from drums. And this is where its traditional character ceases. And because behind it is this incredible rotunda. Now, the Greeks never used, they used rotundas, they called them tholus, and usually they were structures that marked graves, that were mausoleums. Those were little rotundas, but on such a scale, it was never built. It was built under the Emperor Hadrian, who was the lover of all things Greek. In fact, he is one of the first to begin to grow beard. Romans usually were clean-shaven since the time of, and now I will forget his name, of course, the one who defeated the Carthaginians.
Hannibal?
The one who defeated Hannibal.
Well, Hannibal was defeated by Scipio Africanus.
Thank you very much. Who was defeated by Scipio Africanus. And he began to shave his face. And that was in the 2nd century BC. And ever since then, the Romans were clean-shaven. But now Hadrian grew the beard as Greeks grew beards, because he loved all things Greek. And there, under his eye, was built the Pantheon. The extraordinary thing about the Parthenon is that
Pantheon.
Yes, is that one can inscribe a perfect sphere inside the building itself, because it is equal measure, diameter, and height. It's probably one of the very few, probably the only really significant building that has remained since antiquity. I cannot say intact, but relatively intact, even with the original marbles in place. And that is because it was turned into a Christian church, and as such survived. It originally had a bit of a forum in front of it, which later on the church will adopt as, in monasteries, it would become a cloister. So it had its own entrance forum with its old triumphal arch, with, of course, the traditional portico, and then inside cement was used in a very singular way, because that dome is extremely heavy. So the cement that was used in the dome itself, that's the case where a lighter stone was mixed into the cement to make it lighter, and then the design of the coffered ceiling, the waffle ceiling, if you wish, also lightened the cupola tremendously. And also there's an oculus. There's this oculus which is something like 30 meters in diameter. I don't remember the exact measurement. And it's just an open space. It's an open space. No, that's not it. Here. There's the oculus. It's an open space through which rain or snow, what have you, will fall through. And under the floor, there are pumps that take away water when water does come. Presumably, the cupola, or the interior, was painted blue with bronze gilded rosettes in every coffer right there, so it would appear as if one exists inside the universe, inside a spheric universe. And indeed, as some of you probably know, walking into the building is an amazing experience. The spatial relations that one doesn't even account for. That it just appeals to your sense of balance, proportion, your sense of beauty, and the sense of belonging in the universe is very much there. Really an amazing building. Also, what they did here, of course, is that they manipulated, as you see, they manipulated the thickness of the wall so that the lowest part of the wall, again, the heaviest, to carry on all this weight. And another thing that they began to do with the Pantheon, do I have, I don't have a painting, do I? No, I don't have it. Oh, yes, I do have the painting. You can see it in this painting by Giovanni Paolo Panini, who was an 18th century Italian painter and who essentially painted enormous postcards, beautiful, for the travelers. There were no postcards in existence, so Panini and a number of other Italian painters painted these incredible views of Rome, very, very beautifully. And here, and in a painting, you can manipulate the size, because even the best of cameras has difficulty to catch the space, whereas a painting still can. And here you see what the Romans did. They began to manipulate space. For the Greeks, their rectangular structures, their temple structures, sort of they limited the space with the walls. The Romans began to sculpt the space. They turned architecture into this giant sculpture. And the space with the spaces there, they're either niches or they are rectangular spaces, and they alternate. And just as you see the pediments, the pediments, excuse me, as you the pediments alternate with the triangular pediments alternate with the tympana, with the round pediments. So the niches will alternate with the rectangular niches. Very, very interestingly, and it's the Romans were the first to begin to do this. And this is from bird's eye view of the Pantheon. Looks like something in space, actually. And here are all the views. And now we travel next to the city of Pompeii, and the city of Pompeii will be covered by the explosion of Vesuvius back in 79 AD, covered completely. But what was a tragedy, of course, for the people then, became a boon for archaeologists. It began to be uncovered in the 18th century. It's still not uncovered. I mean, the majority of it is still very much underground. But what was extraordinary about Pompeii was that suddenly we saw paint, because paintings did not survive. The Greek paintings didn't survive. Roman paintings did not survive because they just didn't. But here in Pompeii they did. The wall frescoes survived. Many mosaics survived. This is what Pompeii presumably looked like. This is what it looks like today. This painting is done by a Russian painter, Karl Brulov, The Last Day of Pompeii. It is very dramatic. It's not accurate because no lava ever reached Pompeii. In fact, Pompeii was buried under pumice.
And then molten ash from the pyroclastic surge.
Thank you very much. That's how Pompeii was buried. No lava ever came to Pompeii. But of course, in Brulov's interpretation, it's all very, very dramatic. In fact, because of the way that people died there. They were, it was as if they were surrounded by ash, and then the ash petrified, and as the flesh decayed, it created lacunas inside petrified ash. So when archaeologists began to cut through it, they observed, they realized, they saw these lacuna, and it took them a while, but then they finally realized that this is people themselves. So they began to pump plaster into those lacuna, and then and as a result, we have the images of the people who died in the city, and some with expressions and some even with teeth that survived.
There's some really insane interaction between the living people of today and the dead of Pompeii. There's this one photo, I can find it if you want.
Yeah.
It's of an archaeologist, an older man, and he's carrying the body of a little boy that's been that who is now a plaster cast, but the way he's holding him is obviously like that
Right.
of a little boy, and this comparison of, this is still a grown man still holding a child, separated by millennia and catastrophe.
Yuck.
Do you want to see it, or?
Not right now.
Oh, no, I'm
But,
just going to
yeah.
show it to him.
Yeah, well, maybe we'll include it in the lecture.
Sure.
Wonderful. Again, the reconstruction of the city of Pompeii, as it probably was. Today, if you, for instance, go to, not Ecuador, there are towns in Spain and there are towns in South America that, well, Spain, of course, was occupied by the Romans, and the Roman soldiers settled there, and they built themselves towns which look like Pompeii, and then from Spain, conquistadors went to South America, and there are towns in South America today that are living, breathing towns that suddenly you realize you are in ancient Pompeii. Antigua in Guatemala, yes, just totally like Pompeii, and even the volcano in the background. Now we're going to talk about a Roman domus, the evolution of a Roman house. It originally, the Roman house was just a very simple structure right here with an opening in the middle for the water to collect, and then a little kitchen garden in the back. Very primitive, very simple, very pragmatic. But then the Romans began to expand, and soon enough they came across the Greeks, and they saw what the Greeks were doing. They were very impressed, and thus began the so-called Greek additions, right here. So the original house is, you walk in, there's the impluvium, there's the little basin into which the water is collected, and then the rooms essentially extend from that central room and the little kitchen garden in the back. But then, as they expanded, as they grew wealthier and wealthier, they were able to add to their original house. And then ultimately you have something like this. The Romans did not like minimalism. They loved paint. They loved color, and color was everywhere. And of course, only the very wealthy could afford such palaces in Rome, and they were usually on the Palatine. But in Pompeii, you still had to be wealthy to afford a similar house, but still not as wealthy as in Rome. And Pompeii, of course, affords us an extraordinary number of these houses, and a variety of houses, and the evolution of houses. And here we see some of them. This is the impluvium. Now it has 4 columns, which is 4 Corinthian columns, no less. And then this very famous sign of Cave Canem, which is aware of the dog in front of the entrance. This part is from the Metropolitan Museum of Art, which imported one of the rooms from the Roman household with the frescoes. And this is a mosaic fountain. Here's still another house with this very, very famous mosaic of Alexander the Great. Here is the mosaic, recreation of the mosaic. And here as they found it. And there it is now in the museum in Naples, in the archaeological museum, beautiful museum in Naples, hanging on the wall. It presumably was copied from a Greek painting, but we don't know. And it shows Alexander the Great right here fighting against Darius at the Battle of Issus. And it's very apparent from here that the Greeks knew proportion, they knew foreshortening, they knew how to portray light, they knew how to portray perspective, they knew all of that. And unfortunately, none of it survived. But then, of course, they did transfer the knowledge to the Romans. But even after the Romans, it all disappeared. It will take Renaissance to resurrect all those principles. Sculpture and architecture will be there, but not art. So here's Alexander, here's Darius. Darius is in his chariot, and you see the black horses are taking him away from the battlefield. He is horrified at seeing one of his adjutants being speared through by Alexander's spear, and all the emotions are there. Foreshortening is brilliantly represented by the horses. Here we only see, in fact, the back of the horse. There's also the principle of reflection, and one of Darius' soldiers is looking at himself in the mirror, and that is how we see the expression on his face. The emblem of Medusa is on Alexander's armor, and the armor shines. He himself shone without the helmet, his hair blowing in the wind, very much a romantic hero. Also in Pompeii, they developed four basic styles, and of course everything in between. And it was Augustus who was a German, who, 19th century Germans classified, organized, systematized all human knowledge, and the Pompeian styles as well. So he distinguished four significant styles in the development of Roman art. And then, of course, there are styles in between and transitional styles and what have you. But the four essential ones, one is, the first, is the wall is painted and molded in stucco to imitate masonry blocks. Because, not just masonry blocks, but also marbles and also lapis lazuli, and also veined stones of Egypt, all sorts of beautiful, beautiful stones which would be very, very expensive to bring, but which could be painted, malachite, this sort of thing. And so that was the first style. Then the second style, it seems that the Romans now wished to dissolve the walls. Sort of back in the 70s, in New York, everybody wanted to cover their walls with mirrors, so that there were no walls, they would just be reflections. And this was the sort of thing, the naturalistic style, natural appearances. The entire wall would be turned into a garden. The entire wall would be turned into a landscape, seascape, cityscape, any one of those. But so the room would seem much, much larger than it really was. Then that turned into the so-called third style, where the second style shrunk into delicacy. It all became very, very delicate, very subtle, very inorganic, in fact, very artificial, but very beautiful, nevertheless. And then the fourth style essentially was the combination of all of the previous styles. But as I said, these are just the four markers. In between there were various combinations of them. Here, for instance, is an example of the first Pompeian style. And this is the combination of the second Pompeian style. The Metropolitan Museum of Art also has the second Pompeian style right here in that room. Here's part of it. And the Romans, you see, knew the one-point perspective. They knew how to represent perspective, and here it is shown. And in this case as well, look at the representation of water and the light that penetrates the glass jar, as well as there's also a cast shadow, and the whole thing looks very naturalistically. In Pompeii also they found this fresco that shows the fight that actually took place. We have records of it, and this is the Pompeian amphitheater. An amphitheater here, and here's the picture of it also with that kind of stuff. I forgot to say when I was talking about the Colosseum that the Colosseum is an amphitheater. An amphi means double, as in an amphibious creature. An amphibious creature is can live on the ground and underwater, above water, underwater. She is amphibious. A Greek theater is oblique or semicircular structure where theatrical performances took place, and that was not. I mean, Romans adopted the Greek theater very much for their theatrical performances, but for something like gladiatorial games, they needed something much larger and something that would be theater in the round, so to speak. So they took two theaters, two semicircles or oblique circles, oblique semicircles, and put them together, and that's why it's called amphitheater. It's a double theater. A Yankee Stadium is an amphitheater, and this as well is an amphitheater. Here it is in Pompeii today. And a brilliant example of the second style of painting is outside of Pompeii proper, actually in the Villa of the Mysteries. And the reason it's called the Villa of the Mysteries is because it contains these extraordinary frescoes whose meaning we don't really know. We can only suspect, because it was a mystery, so nothing was written down, and only the initiated were privy to what the mysteries were about. It seems to be some sort of a ceremony dedicated to the god Dionysus and his cult that was prevalent in Rome at the time. It is done as a theatrical performance on a very shallow green stage, and it goes from left to right around the room with one young maiden that goes through various stages of initiation, and beautifully done. Here's one of them here. She is being lashed in one of the processes of initiation, whereas here she finally is part of the cult and rejoices at the fact. The third Pompeian style, you see, is this. You take the second Pompeian style and shrink it to make it a little painting on the wall, and that's what this becomes. This is this beautiful, beautiful, very, very elegant colonnades that could never exist in real life. Of course, they would snap immediately, but they do exist in painting. And then this is also called the black style. And then in the middle is this tiny, tiny little painting that is part of it, but it could very well be just the painting that you can take from the wall. And the fourth, as I said, it's pretty much everything combined together. The Romans did have apartment buildings, as you see, called insulae Romanae. They had sculpture, and they have sculptural relief as well. We are back in Rome now. We left Pompeii. We're back in Rome, and much of their sculpture was allegorical. And in this case, for instance, this was a pedestal, the column set on it, the column of Antonius Pius, where Antonius Pius, one of the emperors, one of the good emperors, is seen in his apotheosis as he leaves the the field of Mars, and this one is an allegory of the field of Mars. Well, they painted it. I mean, they sculpted it.
I'm sure they painted it too.
Well, he was a god of war, and he needed to convey his ability.
Yep.
To say the least.
Yep.
So there's our. Let's go back to Antonius Pius right here. The allegory of the goddess Roma, who is looking at Antonius Pius, and then up above. I don't know who is up above. It might be the previous emperor and his wife above him. But the most important thing is that this is he who is joining the gods. Here, what you see on each side is the procession, is the ceremonial procession of a cavalry. And what's interesting is that that the Romans chose now not the naturalistic representation on one ground, as they showed the triumph of Titus in Jerusalem in that flat semicircle, but they in fact chose a vertical presentation, which of course is going back to the styles of Egypt and the styles of Mesopotamia, where the necessity for information was more important than the naturalistic representation. And so we see this shift back in priorities. Still, the horses are small, of course, just as they were small on the column of Trajan, and but they're not done nearly as well as they're done on the column of Trajan. And men too are sort of becoming more cylinders than men. The men in the middle are given the ground to stand on. Fortunately, they are not made to float in space as essentially the ones above them do float. So this is kind of a good example of. This is the middle of the 2nd century, and my God, the Greeks are still producing spectacular, very naturalistic art. But there's this other tendency to see a different representation, more what we would call today modern art, than say the academic art. Yeah. Still, nevertheless, Marcus Aurelius is still done very much in the academic style. It's an equestrian statue of really the last of the 5 good emperors, and probably the last really. I mean, there were great emperors later, of course, Diocletian, Constantine, but with Marcus Aurelius, the greatness of Rome ended. The greatness of imperial Rome ended, even though Marcus Aurelius obviously didn't know it. And he was a Stoic philosopher, so it is an equestrian statue in bronze. As a philosopher, he's not wearing his military ammunition, but a civilian toga, and presumably originally under the hoof of his horse lay a defeated barbarian, and with a gesture of his arm, of his hand, Marcus Aurelius pardons him, and by the same token, his people, as he accepts them into the Roman Empire. He used to sit right outside, right in the middle of the Michelangelo's Capitoline design, but then it was decided about 20 years ago to take him in and to recast another sculpture. So another sculpture now sits outside, and he is inside. Here you can see him. And yeah, as I said, he was really the last great emperor of the Roman Empire. Strangely enough, Commodus, his blood son, became the next emperor. Up until now, the tradition developed that each emperor would in fact adopt, certainly in the last 100 years, each emperor would adopt his successor from the most successful generals who proved themselves as commanders, who proved themselves as leaders of men, who proved themselves as brilliant administrators, clever with finances, and which custom inaugurated the 100 years of unprecedented prosperity in Rome, the 2nd century, beginning in the first, at the end of the 1st and in the 2nd century. So why Marcus Aurelius, who was one of the greatest minds that Rome produced, bequeathed his empire to his son, whom he knew was entirely incapable, is everybody's question. There's a question of conspiracy that perhaps he did wish to adopt a capable general, and
he wanted to adopt Russell Crowe.
That's right, exactly. He wanted to adopt Russell. Yeah, that's
instead of this guy who looks like a college frat bro.
Right. That's the Gladiator. The film is about that.
Yeah.
Marcus Aurelius wanted to adopt a great general who was played by Russell Crowe. Exactly. And Commodus, of course, interfered with that design. He was mad, really, and he fashioned himself a Hercules. This particular bust is spectacular, not because of the subject, but because of of whoever carved it. It's beautiful. It's beautiful, beautiful carving. And as Hercules, he is wearing the lion's head, and has Herculean baton in his right hand, and the apples of Hesperides in his left hand.
I like how he's kind of sticking his pinky out as he's holding the club.
Oh, this
just,
one?
Yeah, the pinky's just a little bit up, like it's a teacup instead of, the club of Hercules or anything. Ow.
He also fashioned
Let me do
himself...
like 12 tasks.
I know. Oh God. You bet. He also fashioned himself as a gladiator, as we know from the Gladiator, and ended his life by being murdered by one of his associates. Let's see, what else do we have here? And as I said, after that it was all down. There was an age of the so-called Baroque emperors. Sometimes an emperor wouldn't be there for more than a year, and most of them were assassinated. And you can see the change in faces. This, for instance, is the one who actually apparently was emperor for 5 years. And he's called Philip the Arab, and the face is cruel and obviously concerned. The most famous of those is the Emperor Caracalla in the early 3rd century, and today he's mostly famous for his baths. The baths of Caracalla, where the 3 tenors first had their concert, was it 20 years ago, 30 years ago? Goodness. The famous Roman baths that consisted of frigidarium, cold water, tepidarium, tepid water, and where is tepidarium? Oh, and caldarium, very, very hot water. So one could alternate, but actually the baths really were, they were not just health clubs, but they were country clubs. They had libraries, they had places for meeting, they had places for exercise, for massages, for anything and everything. Think of today's country clubs, that the baths of Caracalla, the Roman baths in general, answered those necessities. This is what's left of it today. This is what presumably it looked like at the time it was built. This just explains how one went from caldarium to frigidarium to tepidarium, or in between, and all the baths had, of course, dressing rooms and meeting rooms, and, as I said, and gardens and cafes and coffee shops. Don't know about coffee shops. This is a restored view of the Frigidarium, and much is said that Roman architecture looked very much at the architecture and decoration of the baths, even for their basilicas and for their temples. This is a basilica, and this is the original Penn Station. The Penn Station that was built very much in emulation of the baths of Caracalla. Unfortunately, it only stood for 50 years, and misguided minds in the mid-60s, enamored with the modern architecture, decided to, not that all modern architecture is bad, but they decided to...
Gaudi is good.
Gaudi is wonderful.
Yeah.
I loved our... in Princeton,
the thing that looks like the Parthenon,
right,
next to the fountain
exactly,
off the campus.
Yeah, exactly.
That's beautiful.
The Woodrow Wilson School.
The Woodrow Wilson.
Yeah. So at any rate, so the Penn Station was razed to the ground, and well, the present unfortunate structure was built in its stead. This is the Penn Station inside. This is what presumably the baths of Caracalla looked like inside. This is just 19th century, was enamored with all things Greek and Roman, and the pre-Raphaelite painter Lawrence Alma-Tadema imagines the Roman baths at the time when the Roman baths were no longer separated women from men, but were all together. These are other imagined structures of the baths all over the empire. These are the baths of Diocletian, and still other stuff. Modern interior designers have something to learn from these. Hadrianic baths in Leptis Magna, that's in northern Africa. And then slowly but surely the Roman Empire, plague came and wiped out half the empire, and one man could no longer oversee all the lands, and Diocletian then decided to split the empire into the eastern part and the western part, and appointed a colleague and then two Caesars. So the eastern part would be ruled by an Augustus and his associate, his junior associate, who would be given the title of Caesar, and then the Western Empire would also be ruled by an Augustus and his junior associate called Caesar. And this little statue that we see here, it lives in Venice today, shows in a very cylindrical, reduced fashion the four rulers, two Augustuses and two Caesars. And as you see, the natural representation has gone out the window. We're back to very cylindrical, very inexpressive style, which only has as its purpose to convey to the population the knowledge of the four such dignitaries, since there were no televisions or computers or iPhones. Such information was conveyed through art, and this is one part of it. This is Venice, the Palace of the Doges, and this is where the statues sit. The Palace of the Doges, and here the Porta Ducale, here it is. So the empire was now split. It was split into the eastern part and to the western part. The eastern part is known as the Byzantine Empire, but the Eastern emperors never ever called it that. They always called themselves Roman emperors, and they always called themselves the Roman Empire. The reason it's called the Byzantine Empire is because in the early 4th century, the Emperor Constantine transferred the capital of the empire from Rome to a little town of Byzantium, right here, to which he gave his own name, and that town became Constantinople, today known as Istanbul. but it's from that little name of Byzantium that the entire eastern half of the land will become known. With time, the West will be overrun with the Germanic barbarians and also the Huns, while the East will remain intact for another 1,000 years, considerably shrunk towards the end, but it will remain. The Eastern Roman Empire will still be there for 1,000 years. Meanwhile, in the West, with Diocletian efforts to somehow maintain what was clearly beginning to fall apart, he built himself, he did not live in Rome anymore. He built himself a beautiful palace in what today is Croatia. It's in the town of Split, which is Spoleto, which is palace. And this palace now looks like, it now looked like a fortress. It still exists, leftovers of the palace exist, and here it is. It's very picturesque, and Dalmatia in general, of course, is very, very beautiful. And Emperor Constantine will now rule the land. And I think we'll finish at this point and continue soon thereafter. Thank you very much, and I'll see you soon again.